Today, South Africa marks the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. SA Today is bringing you a special focus on this historic day. My colleague Unathi Batyashe is at the Constitutional Hill to celebrate the day with us. Let's cross live to her now.
Thank you very much, Flo. That's correct. We're coming to you live from Constitutional Hill on the 25th year commemoration of South Africa's Constitution since it was signed into law. While described as a living museum, the Constitutional Hill essentially describes the journey of South Africa's democracy. I mean, no words can adequately describe just how you feel when you walk through the walls of Constitution Hill. Not only is the Constitutional Hill home to the Constitutional Court, which serves as the ultimate guardian and the protector of the Constitution, the precinct incarcerated many of South Africa's stalwarts and freedom fighters in prison cells like this one where I'm in now. There's the women's jail, of course, that's a little bit further out from where we are, and we're currently filming at the old fort and the number 4 cells. I mean, the conditions are, a stark reminder of the atrocities that South Africans probably felt back then. I say South Africans because these prisons didn't only host just South Africans, but they also held some of our stalwarts, our freedom fighters, right in these walls. So today we'll be reflecting on South Africa's journey to democracy. I have a panel of guests that will be in conversation with me throughout the next hour or so. And in fact, we're moving into the next room, and you'll see there when I talk about the living museum. Of course, we're saying it's been 25 years since South Africa's Constitution was signed. So today we reflect really on not only how the Constitution has transformed the legal, the social, and the economic landscape, but also how it's fared, in terms of its promise of human rights and dignity of South Africans. All right, I am now going into the next room, where I am going to be joined by my panel. I have 2 guests right here that are coming to you live with me, and I've also got 2 other guests that will be virtual. All right, so I'm going to move right across and introduce my panel. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. So I'm joined by legal expert, Advocate Romeo Ntabeleni. Thank you so much, Advocate, for joining us this afternoon. I'm also joined by Professor Samadoda Mfikeni, political and policy analyst, who's going to be joining us live on Zoom a little bit later on, but I'm also in conversation with the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and that's Mr. Silo Hatang. Thank you so much, gentlemen, to you both. Perhaps, Silo, let me start with you. Now, earlier this morning, you were invited, of course, to this panel, the webinar discussion, just around the journey that we've taken so far, up to so far in terms of our democracy. And I'm very, very much interested in the topic of the conversation that you held, really speaking about how far we have come as a country, and also speaking about, how can this Constitution really become a catalyst, for change? I want to start here. As the Nelson Mandela Foundation, do you think that the Constitution, the people of South Africa, really embody the values that were held by Nelson Mandela?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think as the foundation, it's the journey ahead is still long, and we say so because if the Constitution really delivered on what was intended by our forebears, it would have delivered a more united South Africa, a South Africa that's more equal, a South Africa whose education system delivers for the poorest of the poor. It would have pulled a lot of people out of the poverty that they experienced. It would have dealt with our woundedness. It would have helped to at least rebuild the economy that we cry for. But that's putting too much on the Constitution. Now, I was saying earlier on that we forget that we are the Constitution. And if we remind ourselves that the Constitution is a document that we have here, but the Constitution is actually us. We constitute the Constitution, which means that we as South Africans should begin to be taking responsibility for the content that or the aspirations that come through our forebears as expressed in the Constitution.
Now, Advocate, let me bring you in here. So as we, reflect in these 25 years, from a legal perspective, how much has the Constitution really changed the legal landscape? I mean, it's been lauded as one of the best in the world, but in practice, is it really, are we really seeing the changes that we need to see from a legal perspective?
Thank you so much, Unathi, and thanks for the invitation. Yes, I can say that since the advent of democracy in South Africa, there's been a lot that the Constitution has brought in relation to the judgments that we have seen since the State versus Makwanyane judgment in relation to the death penalty and the advancement of human rights in South Africa. As you have rightfully said, Unathi, this is a good instrument and a live a document. As the CEO has actually said, we need to live out of that Constitution ourselves and see the realization of the aspirations of the leaders that crafted this Constitution for it to be made to be more alive. There are very good judgments that we have seen coming from the Constitutional Court itself and affirming the Constitution and its supremacy in South Africa. Section 2 of the Constitution is very clear. It says this document is the supreme law of the land. Any act or conduct that is inconsistent with it should be declared invalid. So insofar as its application is concerned, it's a very a good document, grounded. It stands head and shoulders above the rest in the world, and it's a very good instrument, but it's a working document. As the CEO is saying, we cannot expect it to be perfect. We work with it moving forward in the legal framework.
Thanks, Advocate. Now, I want to bring in former Constitutional Court Justice Albie Sachs now into the conversation, and he's joining us via Zoom. Justice Sachs, thank you so much for your time this afternoon and for joining us. Now, you were also in conversation in the webinar that was, planned by government this morning, just reflecting on this 25-year journey as far as our Constitution is concerned. You mentioned something very interesting, Justice Sachs, and that is around corruption. Of course, with the Zondo Commission, the report now coming out in January the 1st, we know that corruption has been very pervasive in the last couple of years in South Africa. You mentioned something interesting, saying that during the drafting of the Constitution, there was really not a body that was, founded to deal specifically with corruption as independent as some of our Chapter 9 kind of entities that are currently in existence now. I know you were speaking in your personal capacity, but perhaps elaborate on that. What kind of body would we be talking about that would perhaps have helped in the Constitution at the time?
Right, so we set up a body to deal with gender inequality, a body to deal with human rights generally, the public protector to deal with malfeasance in the administration, the Auditor General to check on the books, the Judicial Service Commission to ensure free and fair elections, and the Judicial Service Commission on appointment of judges, Independent Electoral Commission. We didn't set up an anti-corruption commission. And maybe at that time, we didn't envisage the problems that would emerge in relation to corruption. And I think this is an area where we could even think of amending the Constitution and hopefully get cross-party support for an independent body to join the other Chapter 9 institutions, chosen by Parliament after public scrutiny and having the correct qualifications, but independent of government, independent of law enforcement, and given the mandate to deal with corruption wherever it might be. And one of the problems with corruption is, of course, its worst impacts are when it deals with the agencies of government itself, who could then smother the inquiries unless you have an independent body of that kind. So that was the idea that I threw out. Now, I might mention the other thing we hadn't envisaged was the impact of HIV and the pandemic. But when it came to dealing with people living with HIV, the Constitutional Court was able to expand the equality provisions to cater for to deal with discrimination against people because of their medical status, and also able to, under the right of access to healthcare, to ensure that antiretrovirals were made available to everybody. That didn't require a separate institution. But in the case of corruption, with the Scorpions being disbanded, problems with the Hawks, being under-resourced and so on, I think a very strong case can be made out for creating a new Chapter 9 institution, and hopefully it could get cross-party support as something in the national interest without dealing with corruption, as the Constitutional Court itself, in a very beautiful judgment by Becca Moseneke and Edwin Cameron, pointed out, all the other fundamental rights are subverted if the instruments for the guaranteeing of the rights and protecting the rights themselves are open to corruption.
Perhaps let me bring in Professor Fikeni, who has just also joined us via Zoom. Prof, as a policy and political analyst, you obviously have done some research, just in terms of what transpired 25 years ago as this document that has been hailed as one of the best in the world. Would you say that it is fair to those that are saying today that whilst it is the best in the world in terms of on paper, it really has failed our people when we start to talk about equality in this country?
That is correct, because the objective reality is that inequality has just worsened. And the conditions on the ground, unemployment, poverty, gender-based violence, you name it. But key is the point that Silo Hatang has mentioned. Human agency is the most important element that we have actually not factored in to say the document might be good, but those who are driving it, be they leaders or the citizens, are the ones to ensure that it succeeds. And also it is where you might have had some weaknesses. And the weakening of the institutions, especially public sector institutions, has also been one major challenge, because service delivery, fighting corruption, law enforcement, all dwells in that particular space. But once you started having corruption, as Justice Albi Sachs was saying, you start having the weakening of institutions as the patronage networks take over, where loyalty instead of competence is a major factor. But the key element in all these, the potential that is there within the document, is amazing. But its realization is almost impossible if we don't deal with the issue of agency, but also with the issue of equality, because for some of these rights to be exercised, you must have some reasonable degree of resources to exercise them. That's why now it is left to just a few individuals, best armed with lawyers, a few NGOs, to deal with many of the issues, the rest of the 60 million population being on the margins. And that was not what was envisaged.
Fantastic. Of course, Silo, you can't have heard what our guests are saying because of COVID, obviously having had some guests on Zoom. Advocate Ntombeni also not hearing what Justice Sachs and what Professor Fikeni was saying, but essentially saying that, of course, the Constitution is one document that is very, very highly lauded, on paper, but, that you need to give some form of agency to the people, as you've been saying, Silo, just in terms of, getting that accountability back into the people's hands. But, of course, there are constraints. Not everybody can fight the inequality that we are seeing, and it's left, as Professor Fikeni Tambeleni said, to just a select few. So just in terms of taking that accountability as an active citizenry, I think just coming out of the local government elections, we saw people that were united in their voice in terms of, we are saying no to corruption. We are exercising our rights, and we are making a change. So what then can people start doing, particularly those that say, we know our rights, but then they don't exercise their rights? What then are the constraints in which they can operate in?
One of the things that is so powerful about the Constitution is that it actually gives you some power as an active citizen. It says you can choose the leaders of your choice. Go out and vote for them. And the example you're giving of the recent elections is it has this stark memory for me of how you then have citizens who can exercise that right, and they go and choose someone who is a convicted fraudster. They go and choose someone who's a convicted rapist. And these are choices we make, and we are in a bit of a mess at the moment because of choices we make. And I think if we are to give credence where it belongs, the Constitution empowers us. We disempower ourselves with the decisions we make sometimes at the ballot point. Then there's a thought that I think we should also be thinking about. Institutions that are supposed to then be protecting the rights, aspirations, dreams of South Africans, which were destroyed over time. Now we have to rebuild them. What does that rebuilding process look like? And the question that we should be asking ourselves as a citizen, as an active citizen, what are my obligations? So yes, I have rights, but what are my obligations? Part of that is to hold those who are closest to you in terms of power they exercise accountable. Once we do that, it means that we are beginning to then shift it a bit to say we are constitutional beings where the rule of law applies to all of us. And rule of law also includes just being a free person who can walk the streets freely, a woman who won't be heckled when she's walking the streets. Those are things that we should be worried about at the moment. The Constitution empowers us to do different. It's aspirational in its expression. We have to make those aspirations real.
Advocate Ntambeleni, perhaps, just to, piggyback on what Silo is saying, but just in terms of recourse, we've seen just very recently the Constitutional Court coming under fire, saying that it actually doesn't uphold the rule of law when it comes to certain people, and certain people are actually given some form of leeway. But where we start having to come out as an active citizenry saying, enough is enough, we are now going to test this Constitution, and we're now going to go the legal route. Never mind the fact that those people that the Constitution, that probably aren't serviced well by the Constitution, are probably the poorest of the poor. People with no money. They have no clout. They have no lawyers, strings of lawyers coming to their aid, and we have got those institutions that are meant to be looking after them, that are of course not servicing them.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I should just piggyback on what the CEO was saying, that it starts with us. I'll give you an example. I was recently stopped by a traffic officer, and the traffic officer stopped me and he was asking me for money. And I said to him, I'm not going to do that. And as he's actually saying, we need to make this living document, a reality, so that we can be able to realize the dream that are in the document. When the document is sitting on the table, it won't do anything for us. In terms of access of justice to the majority of the people of South Africa that don't have access to courts and justice, you find that there are institutions like the legal resource centers and the legal aid clinics around where people can access justice. And the Constitutional Court has an open door policy as well in terms of assisting indigent members of the public in terms of institutions that can be able to help them. They can approach the Constitutional Court and they will be directed at the right places where they can get assistance so that their rights can be reaffirmed by the Constitution. Recently, Unathi, there was an issue of land expropriation, which is a big elephant in the room that we are supposed to be discussing, by the way. And we all know what became of that bill in Parliament. at least we need to start taking steps moving forward, because you cannot have equality when people are hungry. You cannot have equality when people are sleeping in their empty stomach. It's very good for us to come and dissect the Constitution, but if the majority of the people are not eating, it's not going to help them. They say that there is this precious document that is lauded all over the world, but it does nothing to me. So it is the responsibility of government as well to start looking as to where the Constitution can be adopted and promoted to develop the interests of the society.
Thank you so much, Advocate Ntabileni, because I was going to bring that up. Justice Sachs, just on the issue that's just been tabled here today, I mean, we know that it was on this date, 10 December 1996, when former President and the late former President Nelson Mandela signed the Constitution into law, in Sharpeville. But, until then, or since then, since it was enforced in 1997 in February, it has been amended 17 or so times, So what is the problem? Where are we not getting right as it relates to land expropriation without compensation?
Okay, I'm just going to go back to what the other speakers were saying. Just to add, to reinforce to me a very fundamental point, and I'm going to mention the Treatment Action Campaign case as a brilliant example of where the poorest of the poor, the people living in the townships, in the rural areas, living with HIV, desperately wanting access to antiretrovirals, and very high up, people in government were saying, no, the virus doesn't exist, and so on. And the Treatment Action Campaign people on the ground, they organized, and they got investigative journalists to support them, and they got various litigation units that represent the poor without charging any fees to bring a very well prepared case to the Constitutional Court. And the court ordered access to antiretrovirals, and it saved South Africa. It literally saved South Africa. The gloom, the despair, the impact of the pandemic was enormous. And suddenly there was hope because of the rights of access to adequate healthcare in the Constitution, because people mobilized on the ground, because people used the instruments given to them in the Constitution. So it can just be a piece of paper. If it's not used, if it's just regarded, if it's trampled upon, if it's used, it can be a mighty weapon to help primarily the poor. It's been very helpful in terms of rights for women. It's been very helpful in terms of rights for the LGBTQI community. It's been very helpful in at least curbing the excesses of eviction. And it provides a template in which the whole issue of land redistribution can be considered in a very meaningful way. So the point I'm trying to make, and I must say I'm very jealous that you're on Constitution Hill, where I spent so many years, and I'm far away in Cape Town. And just to say, it's wonderful to see the Hill being exposed through the SABC, made familiar, publicized in terms of what it's doing. It's a very emotive place. It tells that whole story of how to get out of gloom and depression and to convert hope into realizable, meaningful rights that people can have. The Constitutional Hill Trust, of which I'm a board member, is working precisely to achieve that. And thanks to the SABC for having the program on the Hill. May many, many more people visit it. I'm sorry I have to leave you now because I'm engaged in another program that I was booked for a long, long time ago. But it's wonderful, and maybe this is the last word. We have free, open debate in our country, partly because of the Constitution, the rights that are guaranteed. The SABC that was captured has now been liberated, if you like, to have views that are critical of government, of those in power, critical of the Constitutional Court. That's the freedom we were fighting for. It's the freedom guaranteed in the Constitution. We're not a fair society. We're not a safe society, but we are a very open society. And the openness through the Constitution and the instruments of the Constitution, the voting, the right to vote, the right to speak freely, the right to demonstrate peacefully, the right to organize, the rights of workers, the conciliation for workers, no unfair dismissals, all sorts of remedies being provided. All of that comes from the Constitution. So I can't help but concluding my remarks by saying, long live the Constitution, long live.
Thank you very much, Justice Sachs, and he leaves us for now. Professor Fikeni, perhaps I can bring you in here, particularly on some of the words that Justice Sachs was talking about. He mentions Constitutional Hill being a very emotive place. I mean, as I said in my intro, when you come here, you can't help but feel the pain that went through these walls. Of course, many people being incarcerated here, but he also, he speaks about a time in our lives in the country that were very painful, and the trauma has lasted for many years. But perhaps those that continue to suffer in this country are women and children. And the cases that we continue to see in terms of GBV are just becoming more staggering. I mean, recently we saw the release of the police stats around GBV stats and femicide. I mean, even in the prison, one of the prisons that we hear, we know that women were incarcerated with their children, with their babies, but times have not changed for women. It may have changed for many other people. Where has the Constitution failed women and children of this country?
Well, I do think that the one major problem that has happened is the fact that the leadership failure to provide leadership and be decisive. And the fact that many of the leaders that we had put our faith in simply were absorbed by the system they were supposed to transform, and they ended up literally focusing on their well-being. The social distance you have seen between leaders and people is one of the challenges. But at the most fundamental level, which needs an overhaul, maybe a national dialogue, so that we have a social compact around the socio-economic issues, because that's where our transition has been the best in terms of putting institutions of democracy and the architecture of it. But when it comes to the socio-economic transformation, that's where challenges have come. How did we fail women and children of this society? It is actually multifold. The first one, at the moment of negotiations, we have had mass democratic movement where community organizations, labor unions, youth formations, women's formations participated because they understood that they were the authors of our destiny. And each time in the South African history where people have risen and participated en masse, we've seen the needle move in the positive direction. We saw that in the mass democratic movement of the 80s, forcing an apartheid regime, making even emergency rules worthless. We've seen this in the 50s, which ultimately produced the Freedom Charter. And we've seen this in the 70s, the Black consciousness movement galvanizing the nation in terms of conscientizing. The moment we retreat and say leaders will do it for us, the moment we retreat and say government will do it for us, we've seen it simply does not happen. That's why more recent elections, more than anything, was an indication of legitimacy crisis that the political class and perhaps entire leadership is experiencing when so many people chose not to participate. That is why some people will need to pay more attention even to the family structure. The collapse of an African family in particular and the value system that led to the collapse of Ubuntu, collapse of communities. No amount of police, no amount of statehood can actually close that particular void. Even some of the churches now, you find that they've become crime scene with pastors raping people and with people doing extortions and so forth. So we need to have that national dialogue and have a social compact to press a reset button.
All right, fantastic. Well, if you've just joined us, this is a special broadcast from Constitution Hill here in Braamfontein in Johannesburg. Of course, on this day, the 10th December 1996, the South Africa's constitution was signed into law by the late former President Nelson Mandela in Sharpeville. I am in conversation with my panelists. We're just reflecting back on the 25 years since the constitution became law. Stay with SA Today. Don't go away.